Support for the Blueprint podcast comes from the SANS Institute. Since the debut of SEC 450, we've always had students interested in a matching course covering the management and leadership aspects of running a SOC. If you like the topics in this podcast and would like to learn more about Blue Team leadership and management, check out the new Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This new course is designed for security team leaders looking to build, grow, and operate a security operations center with peak efficiency, and it's a hands-on technical leadership course that takes you through everything from scoping threat groups to use case creation and organization, threat hunting planning, SOC maturity and detection assessment, and much, much more. Check out the course syllabus, labs, and a free demo at sansurl.com/551, and I hope to see you in class.
This is the Blueprint Podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top Blue Team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS certified instructor John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
Are you a manager looking to build or improve your SOC? Are you trying to understand how to measure your SOC's maturity or your use cases or your threat hunting efforts? If so, today's podcast with Rob Van Os is for you. We'll cover 3 of Rob's awesome projects aimed at clarifying and solving these commonly confusing topics. In today's episode, we hit the SOC CMM for SOC maturity measurement, the MaGMa use case framework for building and tracking SOC use cases, and the Tahiti threat hunting methodology for showing ROI on threat hunting. Rob has put together some amazing guides and models for each of these topics, and we walk through how each of those can help you build the best possible SOC for your org. So stick around for all of that today and more on the Blueprint Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blueprint Podcast. Today we have Rob Van Os on the show. He is a long-time SOC management veteran, and I knew of him because I'd long been aware of his SOC CMM framework and some of the other awesome projects he's been aware of. And so today on the show, I wanted to talk through a few of those things because we haven't really had a management-centric podcast yet. So really looking forward to this conversation and some of the really useful kind of mental models and metrics and management aspects and expertise that Rob brings to the table. So welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Thank you very much, John.
To start off, could you give our listeners a bit of a background on your current role and kind of various activities within the InfoSec industry?
Right, yeah. So my current role is actually a senior security advisor role, which I've started fairly recently. The last 2.5-3 years, I've been active as a SOC manager for a large financial company, one of the largest banks in the Netherlands. And before that, it was just I've been involved in cyber defense, doing sorts of implementations for SIEM solutions, as well as being just one of the specialists in security operations centers and designing incident response teams, that sort of thing. So I've always had a sort of advisor, coordinator role, which seems to fit me fine.
Fantastic. So you've kind of done it all, it sounds like, from incident response to management to designing SOCs and everything under the sun, right?
Right, yeah. I've also done some SOC assessments as well, incident response team assessments, just to see where they're at in terms of maturity and capability, which are one of the things I specialize in.
Yeah. And so speaking of assessments and all that, that's a great segue into our first topic, which is one of the things I wanted to make sure we cover today in a decent amount of detail, which is your SOC CMM. The SOC CMM is an outstanding framework for assessing the various components of a security operations center, looking at the maturity and the various domains and aspects. And I was wondering, could you explain why you created the SOC CMM and what's it for and how you kind of modeled it?
It all started out, I think about 5 years ago when I was doing a master's degree study. I had to choose a project as a final project to get the degree. And one of the things that always interested me is how do you measure something like maturity? How do you measure capability? And if you go looking for it, then you will see that there's HP, which Microsystems now, had an assessment, and IBM had an assessment, and all of those things were sort of vague. You know, they were, you got the model, they were clear about the model, the sort of things that they were trying to measure, but not how they were actually doing it, which automatically gives you a vendor lock-in. Now, you do one assessment and they know the metrics. So if you want to do a reassessment to see if you've progressed, you need to get the same guys on board because, you don't know the exact metrics that they're using. So I wanted to create something which was similar, but then open source and, of course, completely transparent about what metrics are we using to assess certain aspects of a SOC. So what happened is I got a few SOCs on board from different sectors and different sizes, different levels of maturity, and I started to do literature research to find out, what are the common things in a SOC, common aspects of a SOC, and do we actually find them in literature, but do we also find them in an actual SOC? So that was the first part of it, and then all that information gathering and putting it into a model and into an assessment tool, because that was one of the goals, to allow someone to go online, just download the assessment tool and start assessing their SOC without any threshold, without any registration, without any accounts, just be able to do that very quickly with something that was basically self-explanatory. That was the whole initial goal, and I released the very first version, I think around August 2016, so almost 5 years back now, and we're currently at version 2.1. So it has definitely progressed since then.
Very cool. So this is one of the things that I think confuses people as they approach building maybe a SOC for the first time, is just like understanding what are the key components that you would break down a SOC into, right? And the different domains, as you would call them in the SOC CMM. Could you explain a few of those domains and just kind of how you thought about how, organizing the large topic of a SOC into these different categories and what each of those categories kind of contains in it?
Right, yeah. So I was actually looking for a way to logically group all these aspects that I found. And one of the things that you usually refer to easily is just like the people, process, technology, because it's so standard. So that was the first thing on my mind, just to split it up in people, process, technology. And I kind of found out that some of these things don't really fit into those categories. So I needed something else. If you're looking at enterprise architecture, there's always a focus on business as well. And I found that lacking in just, if you're just looking at people, process, technology. So I added another domain, which is business. And ultimately, I decided to put services into it as well, into the model as well, because, of course, technology, you have the technology to do something with it. Basically, you're delivering services as a SOC. So I started outlining, what are the common services of a SOC and what they look like in terms of maturity and capability. So those are the 5 domains, from business, people, process, technology to services. And I mapped each of the aspects that I sort of inventoried into one of those domains.
And so if someone goes and downloads the CMM, like the worksheet from your website, what's the experience they're going to have when they go to try to look at the maturity and assess the maturity of their own SOC? What is that process going to actually look like for them?
I've seen different approaches, but I think what works best is if you have a small team of people doing an assessment together. Because if it's just one person, for example, just a SOC manager going through it and mapping their own ideas of how the SOC is running on the SOC CMM, you will get a certain view from one single viewpoint. But I think it's much more valuable if you have multiple viewpoints. So you have the viewpoint from the SOC analyst and also the SOC engineer, perhaps an incident responder or incident coordinator, also the SOC manager. But I would even say that for certain domains, especially business, you need to have outside stakeholders as well. Don't just keep it within the SOC, but also try to, for example, ask the CISO, just come on and let me hear your view of what we're doing. And if it's properly aligned to what you think security should do for the company, because ultimately you should be serving the business as a SOC. And I've seen SOCs working very, very well autonomously, but not very much connected to the rest of the organization, a sort of separate entity within the organization doing great things in terms of security, but sort of unseen and unknown from the rest of the organization. So I would say, also take external stakeholders for some parts of it, and for the rest, you just create that small team and go through all these questions and have that discussion. I find that if you start out with the SOC CMM, you'll get a lot of discussion on the way you need to answer these questions. But once that's sort of cleared out, you can really start going forward. And part of having these discussions is a lot of sort of collateral things that you find, the collateral findings, things that you really haven't thought about yet and might not even be in the SOC CMM. Just some great things that happen when you're having these discussions about things you normally not think about because you're running your operation.
Yeah, I really like the way that it's kind of broken down within those 5 sections into a whole bunch of detail. You've obviously put a ton of time into this Excel chart. And for those who haven't seen the SOC CMM, it's an Excel sheet with a whole bunch of different sections, and there's rankings and questions and kind of goals, and everything gets input. and broken into those 5: people, process, technology, business, and services. And within each of those, once you go through those, you end up with this, I guess a spider chart would be the right word for it, of
Right.
the assessment for each one of those things. And services, for example, it gets broken down into threat hunting and vulnerability management and all of the kind of subcategories within that, which is a really cool output. And I'm guessing the goal here is to, give people a visual idea of where are their gaps and kind of steer them in the right direction, right?
Correct, yeah. And the level of detail is one of those things that I'm still a little bit worried about it, because there's a lot of questions to go through and there's a lot of detail in the assessment, and it's about balancing, because I could easily add another 1,000 questions to the SOC CMM, no problem there. But you're looking for the right level of detail that allows you to actually steer the SOC in the right direction with the right information. So it's always a balance between too much detail, so too much questions, and too little detail that really doesn't allow you to do some proper steering on it. So I'm still struggling a bit once in a while with should I or should I not add these questions to the SOC CMM? I think it's a mistake to just keep on adding new and new questions, because there's just one huge pitfall. That could be the endless story, which ultimately will result in an unusable set of sheets with like a gazillion questions you're never going to be able to go through.
Right. That is always a struggle, is figuring out, like people want the best answers, but the best answers means the most detail. The most detail means the most time it takes and thousands of questions, right? So with the number of questions you have here, what do you think it would take, roughly for a person to run through and fill out all of these things?
It does depend on the amount of services and the amount of technology, because once you do the profiling, you select which services or which technologies you're going to be evaluating, assessing. So if you have like every technology and every service selected and go through each and every one of them, it's going to be very time consuming. I think like business people and process domains, those are standard. You can't choose there. So those are standard, and you'll probably be able to get through them in like maybe 4 to 6 hours. You should be able to do that. And then technology and services, depending on how fast the team is working and how committed you are to doing it within sort of time boxing it and not having this discussion go on endlessly. And also depending on your scope, it might take another day or two. But I think, this is kind of a large investment. It seems like a large investment in time, especially because, you have to run your operations as well. This is something strategic. This is something about looking where are we, how are we doing, what things we need to improve. And if you do this like once a year, I don't think like spending 40 hours on it is too much time.
Yeah, that's actually your answer to the question I was going to ask next is, it's something that's that big picture strategic kind of planning stuff that you have to do. And it's important to have a goal and have like the snapshot in time of where you are and what you're missing. So, knowing like maybe it's a once a year activity, if it takes a couple of days, that's a good thing to know what like your mindset is when going into wanting to pick up the SOC CMM as something to use for evaluation. One of the other things you said kind of earlier back that I wanted to circle around back to is the tie into the business and how you specifically called that out within this, because the people, process, technology wasn't enough. One of the LinkedIn posts you had put up recently broke down SOCs into different types of SOCs. And you had in there, these kinds of SOCs are maybe better at aligning with the business or better at threat hunting and intelligence and things like that. I thought it was an interesting way of kind of categorizing stuff. And I'm always looking for those kind of easy models for people to lock onto, because I think it helps clarify the problem of what should a SOC be, and what a SOC should be is potentially different depending on where you work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those different types of SOCs you listed and kind of how that helps you decide where people should go in terms of improvement in their SOC.
I was just thinking about these SOC types and especially the primary drivers, because SOCs are rather complex. It's not black and white. You don't just have one single driver which decides everything. There's always going to be multiple stakeholders. There's going to be multiple things at stake as well. But I was looking at it in terms of primary drivers. What is your primary focus as a SOC? And coming from the financial sector, which is pretty heavily oversighted, you will see that compliance is a very important thing within a SOC. There's adherence to internal policy, but also to what the oversight expects you to do which are a lot of regulations as well. So I think compliance can be a very important driver. And I had a discussion on the LinkedIn post as well about compliance and how compliance should never be your primary driver. And that's compliance comes from doing security properly. But it's just, if you're looking at it, it depends entirely on your view, and especially on your sector. I think it's a very easy thing to say compliance isn't that important if you don't have oversight pushing down on you to get compliant. I think that's it really depends on the sector that you're in and what you're trying to achieve. I don't want to say that every SOC within a financial sector is compliance driven, which is absolutely not true, because there's also SOC that have more focus on threat intelligence and are more intelligence driven. But it depends entirely on what you're trying to achieve, what your goals and mission is. And I just wanted to sort of, there's one or two thoughts that I had, what if you had to choose a primary driver, what would it be? I think that it's an interesting thing to think about. And in my experience, I've dealt a lot with compliance-driven SOCs, but also the assessments that I did were with managed security service providers. They have a very different focus. What they're trying to do is to get their security service across to as many customers as possible. So they're not looking for a lot of customization. They're looking for standardization. They're looking for efficient operations so they can serve as much customers as they can efficiently. So this is just a very different focus for your SOC. And it has to do with sector. It has to do with your mission and vision as well. So I think, there are those things to think about if you're looking at the business side of the SOC and your reason to exist.
Yeah, I really like the way you broke it down. The four you had were compliance-driven SOCs and intelligence-driven efficiency and technology. One of the things I'm always seeing and hearing when I'm teaching courses is well, what's the best way? What should I be doing for this? And I hate giving the answer, it depends, but in a lot of cases, that is the answer, right? And this is one way of highlighting that. We're well, do you work for an MSP? Do you work for a bank? Do you work for a small organization? And so that's why I kind of liked this kind of way of breaking it down, is it makes things simple to understand. It says what's your primary objective? If that is the case, these are the things you might want to focus on, steer your metrics towards, and optimize and things like that. So I thought that was a pretty cool way of breaking that down. Speaking of business drivers and metrics and things like that, one of the other kind of related questions is ROI, right? How does a SOC best express the return on investment the business is getting for, the money that the business is putting into that? What are some of the metrics and ways that you have seen SOCs of really any of those types? What are the external facing metrics you like to see a SOC use to show that they are returning the value that the business is hoping?
Very difficult question, this, John, because basically SOCs just cost money. And that's the general idea. And sometimes even save money, but it's very hard to show that. As a SOC, you can say, okay, we've seen all these events, we've acted on all these incidents, and this is what we have saved for the organization. This is our return on investment. Because you can be sure of that. You don't know what the impact would have been of that incident. Possibly you can use the Ponemon cost of a data breach report to use that sort of thing for very focused incidents. It's going to be very hard to actually make it very concrete. If you're looking at these SOAR vendors, usually what they say, this is the time saved because you bought this tool, and this is your return on investment for this specific tool. And that will probably be correct for that tool, even though that you can have a lot of discussion about whether or not those values are actually correct. But still, I think if it's actually saved time, it provides some efficiency, so you can save time, which you can calculate in terms of money. So if it exceeds the investment, then there is a return on investment for that specific tool. But there's more to a SOC than just the SOAR tool. And also, I think the SOC CMM can help you provide some return on investment, because you're doing an assessment. You're saying, okay, these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses, this is what we're going to be investing in. And then a year later, you're going to do another assessment. You're going to say, okay, we've progressed, we've invested in this and that, and now we've progressed to a higher maturity level, which is sort of a return on investment, again, on the specific investments you put into achieving a higher level of maturity, a higher level of capability. But it doesn't really say anything about the SOC as a whole. So it's a very difficult question. And as I was saying, you might use the cost of a data breach to calculate it, but you'd have to estimate the number of data breaches that you've actually managed to stop because of your security operations center. And there's also, of course, a lot of preventative measures in place as well that function autonomously without the Security Operations Center. So if you come up with a formula, I'd be very interested in it.
Yeah, no, I did ask that question knowing that it's a very complex thing. And again, it's one of those, it kind of depends what you're looking for and what you're looking to stop, right? Based on the attackers and the type of disruption you're trying to prevent and all of that. And so, yeah, I do like the approach that the SOC CMM can help you take in saying that, like, this is where we are this year, this is where we are the next year, this is where we are the year after that, and demonstrating that progression. And, my thought about that is there will be in aggregate, statistics on how many incidents you had, the kind of impact and disruption they were having throughout those years. And hopefully, you would see some kind of decrease on that, or maybe on a per incident basis, the number or the price of each one is kind of going down to follow that. It is a really, really difficult thing to do because, like you said, you can't say what didn't happen. How many attacks did you stop today? And I'm always like, I don't know, what's an attack, right? And like that then follows into like, well, how much money did we not spend because we had a SOC today? I don't know, right? But I can say like we're getting better and better at detecting things, and our time is going down and attacks are progressing. They aren't getting as far every time we see an attack, and we're catching more and more spam percentage-wise and whatever, right? It is the eternal struggle of justifying your existence as a SOC. And
yeah, because you always say, okay, so we've had less incident this year. Okay, so does that mean you're functioning better? Does that mean our preventative controls are better? Or does it mean we were less targeted this year?
Right.
Really, really hard to answer that question.
Yeah, that's one of those like, well, there's the external factor of like, you don't control what attacks are happening. And then the internal factor of like, we prevented some, we detected others. And how well did you do in each of those places? Plus how active were the attackers? So yeah, it's really hard math to get to. That might be a good segue into a slightly more technical topic, one of your other projects, the MaGMa use case framework. Could you tell us a little bit about MaGMa and what was the inspiration and kind of aspects of that?
Right. Yeah. So MaGMa came into existence as a joint effort within the Dutch financial ISSAP community. We had a session revolving around the NIST cybersecurity framework. We split it into 4 different sessions that year. So the first one was prevent, and that sort of thing. And we came across to the detect part of this cybersecurity framework, and I said, I've got an idea. Why don't we exchange our use cases? Why don't we exchange what we have in terms of security monitoring at a perhaps higher level, so we can learn or improve our own detections? And that was the kickoff, basically. So we sat together, and then we found that we don't have the same definition of a use case. So that was the first thing we needed to address. So, okay, let's start out with the definition. And once we had that definition, we were looking into, okay, who's already got some sort of relatively mature framework? And ABN AMRO, one of the Dutch banks, one of the largest Dutch banks, they had a pretty good framework in place already, which is sort of the basis for MaGMa. And MaGMa stands for Management, Growth, and Metrics and Assessment. So these 3 pillars, managing your security monitoring use cases, that's one thing, just managing them through the entire life cycle, from designing them and building them and operationalizing them and testing them and improving them. So that whole life cycle. And the things that also drive change, because I think there's 2 different things that drive change. There's things that change in the landscape, which I call environmental drivers for change, like, the threat landscape changes, but also your internal IT landscape changes. There might be new legislation or new compliance rules that also have an effect on your use cases. Even new legislation like privacy, if you have to look again at the use case that you have and see whether they're compliant with in regards to privacy. And there's also the operational drivers, like things, the outcome from your security incidents, also the outcome from your threat hunting investigations and all that sort of stuff that drives the change. So the management of your use cases. And then there's the growth. So we have this use case framework, and it's ever growing. And how do we do that? How do we select the next use case to implement? Which one is more important than the other one? If you're looking at, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's so many things there. There's so many technologies. There's so many things that you could potentially be monitoring for. How do you select the next best thing? How do you select the right things to focus on? And that has to do with growth. in my opinion, MitraTech is so extensive, you need to take a risk-based approach. You need to decide what's most important for me. So you have to understand what do we already have in terms of preventative controls, where's the largest risk in terms of the threat landscape, which actors are part of that threat landscape, how do they operate? And that sort of gives you a view on what's most relevant to you within MitraTech. And then you can prioritize that and then start the growing into your use case framework. And last is metrics and assessment, which has to do with sort of measuring whether you're doing things right. So you can just say, I've got like 500 detection rules. So that must be good, right? Because it's 500. It doesn't say anything about the quality of those rules or the efficiency of those rules. Are they detecting the right things? What's the number of false positives? What's the number of false negatives? Another one is really hard to, because you didn't detect something that happened. So one way to find that out is through incidents or perhaps through more proactive threat hunting. But you also need to find out, what's my false negative rate and all that sort of stuff to measure your set of use cases to make sure that it's not just quantity, but it's also quality.
It's a really nice framework for kind of thinking through the different levels of, I don't know if abstraction is the right word, but the levels of detail. You kind of have like the level 1, level 2, level 3 details and things like that. And I definitely wanted to cover this because I get a lot of questions on use cases as well. And, as we said, like business alignment is kind of like the top level thing we always have to ensure here. Use cases are the thing that kind of says like, why do we exist and how do we specifically implement these things that are going to, detect the things that we're trying to detect that are the reason we exist, right? And so the way you had broken it down is in the like level 1, level 2, and level 3 stuff. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that kind of framework of the different layers for pieces of what goes into a use case. And then the type of like, I guess, software or like, how would you organize use cases? How does a team keep track of all of this stuff? Like what kind of management software or otherwise would you use to track all this?
First about the layers. So the highest layer is the L1 layer, which is basically your risk layer, which should be aligned to your business. So, in that layer, you should be able to find things that are actually business risks. In MaGMa itself, we also use the cyber kill chain, which I think is getting a bit old, especially because MitraTech is a lot better, but it provides too much detail, basically, MitraTech, so you need to find something in between. So what we did is we used the cyber kill chain, which is relatively high level, but still not really a risk, so you should be able to sort of create overlays for specific risks. And then there's the L2, and it's this, how would that risk manifest itself? How would that come into existence? So that's the sort of, I think it's comparable to what MitraTech does with tactics. And then there's the L3 layer, which is the implementation layer. So how have we implemented our security monitoring rule in our security monitoring tooling specifically? And that's where you do your measurements. For each single rule, you do your measurements in terms of how efficient is it, how effective is it, what coverage do I have, that sort of thing.
I really, really like this way of breaking it down because I think it makes it very clear, like we have a use case to cover this one specific thing, right? We have this section on what is the threat, what is the tactic or the technique or whatever. And then it separates that from like, how would that actually be implemented in our tools? And is it there? How much does it cover? Stuff like that. And so you call out specific metrics on each one of those levels. And I think that's a really cool way of approaching it. And the other thing, the software piece. Yeah, back to that. I want to get to that answer before I forget.
Well, one thing is don't build in Excel. That's the basic thing. So we did an example implementation in Excel because it was really easy to create it that way. You can't manage your use cases in an Excel file. You should tie it into your security monitoring system as well. So perhaps because, security monitoring, it's not just your SIEM, it's also your EDR as well. So what potentially could be a good source is if you aggregate all that information into a single SOAR platform, that platform and its potential for automation would allow you to extract all the required information, because you can also sort of aggregate your security incidents as well. So there's a lot of information probably from your SOAR platform if you're using it. And I would say use that as a basis for getting all the information out. I think a lot of things can be automated. I've seen implementations in an actual SOAR. I've also seen implementations in Jira. So that's also an option to do that and to have your to manage your incidents as well and categorize and manage your use cases. I've seen multiple options there. Haven't seen anything yet that is really that you can really download and use right away. So you probably need to build some sort of web interface or something around it to have it work for you.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I haven't seen any purpose-built software for yet. And like you said, some of the ticketing systems out there seem to work fairly well as long as you customize the fields, but nothing kind of tailor-made for security use case storage yet. And when I ask in courses, a lot of people don't tend to have, I wouldn't say a lot, maybe 50-50. It seems like people have like a documented, structured kind of use case database of sorts, and others are just kind of like it's an Excel, or we don't really have anything. We just have a bunch of analytics and we kind of know what to do.
Yeah, or it's in the SIEM system, and that's where all the documentation is. That's also a very common option.
Yeah. So let's say you have all of your use cases put into, the MaGMa style framework and documented in one of these systems. As a SOC manager, asking the question, are we covering what we need to cover and are we detecting what we need to detect? What are the metrics and numbers and kind of things you're pulling out of such a system to try to answer those kind of questions?
I would definitely say, to get aggregated results of all your security monitoring rules, and then that's where the cyber kill chain does help. Even though a lot of it will be in actions and objectives, basically, because that's everything that happens after initial compromise, you still get a sort of view is how we're doing in terms of how am I doing in terms of reconnaissance. So what step of the way am I detecting these incidents going on? I could look at the security monitor use case, but I could also look at the security incidents and to see, okay, so this is where we see these incidents, and at that stage of the cyber kill chain, they were that incident was taking place. So it helps me to kind of say, okay, this is where the incidents take place, and this is where our detection strength is. So what we need to do is to get earlier detection in that cyber kill chain. So we want to move up the chain instead of moving down to actions and objectives, because basically that will be the I'm too late part of the all use case framework to actually really do prevention.
We'll be back after a quick break.
If you're enjoying this episode, then you're undoubtedly interested in building the strongest security operations team that you can. For those who want to go even deeper, did you know that SANS has not one, but 2 courses that cover security operations centers as well? For the leaders, managers, and directors out there, my co-author Mark Orlando and I offer 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This course covers building your team, your physical and virtual workspace, getting the right data into your tools, and then focusing on security priorities through everyday execution of important security tasks and building the best SOC team possible. For the technical practitioners out there, my course SEC 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, Security Operations and Analysis is designed to cover everything you need to jump in being the best SOC analyst that you can be. We cover important data types, SOC tools, security logs, malware, analysis technique, automation, and much, much more. In addition, if you want to prove you can deliver the best on any security team, both courses have an accompanying certification available from GIAC. That's the GSOM for 551 and the GSOC for 450. Check out both courses and free demos available on the SANS website. You can get registered today for an in-person course at one of our many events, or go to On Demand and take either class anywhere at your own pace. Thanks for listening.
In my view, right, my answer to that question is probably largely the same, right? You're looking for defense in depth, right? Evidence of kind of objective way of saying, where are all my detections placed, either in the MITRE attack framework or along the kill chain or any kind of process model of an attack that you can think of, right? If you have all this data entered in a structured way, then as a manager, you can go in and just say, like, show me all my use cases sorted by which ones are command and control, which ones are installation phase and all that stuff. And if you see, a big peak on one and nothing early on, you can say like, oh, we're oversubscribed on later, kill chain stuff, and we need to back it up and maybe catch more delivery or things like that. And so,
right, yeah. And I think what helps here is also that the MITRE attack framework was, of course, it was updated about half a year back, and stuff from the pre-attack framework was integrated into attack. So I think it is, those tactics help to really address the parts of the kill chain that weren't addressed yet in the original MITRE attack. I think it'll be replacing the cyber kill chain entirely in about a year or so. So we probably won't need that anymore. and you can just move on the left side of the current MITRE ATT&CK framework.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of comparison that, people make a lot, right? The kill chain, which was made many years ago now, versus MITRE ATT&CK. And the way I kind of look at that difference is they're both useful, but one's more oriented towards like a chronological model of an attack, and the other one's kind of just by category, what can happen here, right? And so when I'm looking at an attack, if I'm trying to describe chronologically, like how does it progress? Kill chain, pretty good at that. There's a few things that I would maybe add in there just to get a little more detail, but models are models, they leave out detail. And then MITRE ATT&CK is, just kind of the whole like game board of moves, right? With kind of ignoring time. And with that addition of pre-attack, it would be interesting to see if they start making it maybe a kill chain-esque, like, pre-attack stuff. I think they are actually physically putting on the left of the matrix now. And so it will kind of turn into one of those chronological things. So I think it's a great thing for the industry to have, right? It's an awesome resource for blue team members who might otherwise not know how attacks works. And so it ties in great with this.
Circling back to your use cases, I think one of the things that's very important, and what we're getting better as an industry is to do the red teaming, just the validation part, validate that what you've got in place is actually working the way it's supposed to be working. So you don't have to wait for the incidents to happen or go into it earlier, and also the attack simulation tooling, which is also very much progressing. And there's a lot of open source great things out there you can use to do like breach and attack simulation. And I think it's very important, to validate what you've got. You can use these metrics, and I think that it's valuable because you can do that like continuously. But every now and then you need to have challenge yourself and also your SOC. If nothing really bad happens for a long time, will you still be prepared for the worst? So I think red teaming is very important to do, just to keep everyone sharp and on the edge.
Yeah, it's like I always kind of compare it to testing your smoke detectors, right? Like you got to make sure that button still, that alarm will still go off. It sits there, like the green light blinks every once in a while. You're like, I think it's working, right? But if you don't actually try the thing, you might find out in a very unfortunate way that it wasn't, doing what you expect it to do.
Right. Yeah, and the blinking green light would probably be your metrics, saying I'm okay, I'm in control. But a little validation can't hurt.
Right. So diving one more layer, kind of more technically deep, you also have what you call the Tahiti kind of threat hunting methodology. Could you explain that briefly and what brought that about and what that contains?
We created it within the Dutch financial ISSAP when I was the product owner at the Volksbank, and I was looking at threat hunting as well as in terms of proper process. We were struggling with how do we need to address this sort of as a standardized process. And we were looking for proper documentation, couldn't really find it. So first thing we did is just check with the other financials and see, okay, where are you guys at with the threat hunting? And everyone was sort of at the same moment in time, just struggling to find the right way to do it. So we came together and started working out this Tahiti methodology, a Tahiti approach basically to threat hunting. It's also an abbreviation standing for target hunting and integrating threat intelligence. So we wanted to take a threat intelligence approach to threat hunting, just to have it driven by threat intelligence. Because of course you can, if you take a threat hunt, you're going to start out with some hypothesis, and there's about 1 million of those you can probably come up with. So what is the right thing to be focusing on? Again, and this is the same thing that we discussed with the MITRE ATT&CK. What should you be doing first? And I think threat intelligence is very important there. What are the things currently going on in the world? What are your the threat actors that are very specific to your sector, or maybe your geographic region? What are they doing? What types of attack methods are they using? And perhaps some of that information you can take into and create a hypothesis, which is more based on your current situation, your current level of protection, and also your current threat landscape, specifically for your organization. So that was the whole idea, to create something that was more risk-driven. So that's why we created the Tahiti threat hunting methodology. So
with Tahiti, you have certain kind of tie-ins to threat intelligence enumerated. You have metrics broken down and all that good stuff. I think it's a really nice way of kind of looking at threat hunting, as a big topic. And that's another question I get, right? Is like, how do we start threat hunting? How do we measure threat hunting? Threat intelligence, as you said, key piece of that, right? Part one is, are you focusing on the right thing? You can threat hunt for people coming in the ceiling of your data center, but it's probably not a good use of your time, right? Because it's not really something that happens versus like, I don't know, SolarWinds compromise or whatever it happens to be, right? Where do you suggest people start? If this is a new SOC, right? Someone's just building SOC for the first time. Where would they source the kind of threat intelligence, and how might they take the first steps in just picking the right things to threat hunt for?
I would say start out with the MITRE-ATT&CK framework and use the detect, the detect tool, the tool created by Rabobank. And those guys did is just sort of create an overlay for the MITRE-ATT&CK framework based on the detections and the data sources that you have. Don't threat hunt something you don't have data source for. Right? You can't threat hunt if you don't have any data. You need the data. So that's the first thing, you need the data. So what you probably need to focus on is those things you do have data for, but you don't really have proper detections for. And I think that's the sort of the area where would you first start out with your threat hunting. That's not even intelligence driven. That's just lack of visibility driven, which is another way to approach it. Where are my visibility gaps? And that will be probably the right thing to focus on if you're hunting for threats.
So if a team is following the Tahiti methodology and they're going through their data, looking for everything, what do you expect the output to be of like a good threat hunt, whether successful or not, right? Like what are the kind of objective metrics and pieces of a threat hunt that you would expect to be produced at the end?
Right. Yeah. So we did have a discussion on metrics, because as a threat hunter, of course, you don't really want management metrics interfering with your work. But on the other hand, as a manager, you don't want people doing threat hunting investigations all the time with no output. So you do want to have some output. And one of the pieces of output you can find to know, what sort of incidents did we detect? That's the ultimate output. We've done a threat hunt. We were looking for that particular threat, and we found it, and we stopped an incident which was going on in our infrastructure without us knowing it. So that's the ultimate result from a threat hunting investigation. But it's probably not going to be every single threat hunt that's going to end like that. At least if it would, you'd have a major problem probably.
Yeah, hopefully not.
So there's other things that are very important as well, which is basically to help identify weaknesses in prevention, to help identify weaknesses in perhaps in architecture and also in your detection capabilities. And the threat hunting that you did will probably lead to new ideas about how to detect certain things. So you're also continuously improving your detection capabilities as well. So that's the sort of thing that you should be focusing on as threat hunters as well, not just the incident, but also the things around it, helping to continuously improve your cyber defense.
Yeah, I like that way of breaking it down. The way I kind of think about it is pretty much the same, kind of maybe restated, but you want to have the metrics on like, what did you find, right? Because we're assuming a lot of time there is something to find, but not always, right? And a threat hunt where you did good threat hunting, but you didn't find anything isn't a bad thing. There just wasn't anything to find, right? You're not compromised. That's a good thing, right? When you do find stuff, of course, you want to take the metrics on that. So you can say like, when we did threat hunt, we found stuff, and here's what that stuff was. It was important. But when you don't find stuff, you still need some evidence of the effort. And so having metrics, I like tracking, like as a result of hunting, we also created these new analytics, these new use cases. We had these better ideas on how to do stuff. And so that's kind of my approach on uncovering it, right? Is like,
absolutely.
And what was the other output from that effort? What improvements did it lead to? Final question for the day: SOC management, SOC monitoring, and the new state of the world, which will probably be more work from home and cloud-focused services. What do you see in the future for these kind of areas? And how do you think where we are now in 2021, how everything's going to evolve maybe over the next 3 to 5 years?
I was also thinking about this because in the SOC CMM, you have the process domain, which also covers operations and facilities, which is always sort of the standard thing to look at in the analyst workstations and the wall displays and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, right now, I don't think it's proven not to be that important anymore. With almost the entire workforce working from home, I don't have a wall display in my home, so probably don't need one. So I think we've kind of that sort of thinking has probably changed, and I don't think that the Security Operations Center, as we knew it will probably look the same anymore. So that's definitely a change. Also, cloud is definitely a new world. You can't map your on-prem security solutions one-on-one on the cloud. It's just different dynamic going on. There's different technologies being used. You need to go cloud native. If you're, as a company, you're not fully operating in the cloud yet, you probably need like an on-site on-prem security team as well as a cloud security team. I would say, that could be the same person, but it's different in terms of the knowledge that you need to have, the experience that you need to have as well. So I would say for cloud initiatives, go fully cloud native, but you probably need to have an on-prem team as well. So I think these two worlds will coexist until like everyone goes fully cloud native, which is probably only a matter of time. So I see security operations centers going more into the cloud using cloud native tooling, which is, I have to say, I'm very impressed with what's available in terms of cloud native security tooling, also security monitoring and stuff. So that's really great.
The way that we are doing kind of distributed teams now with security operations centers, we used to all sit in the same room. We used to all be able to yell to each other and have these video walls and stuff, like you said. Are there any technologies or in terms of management, like communication with people and making sure those lines of communication stay open? Is there any tactics, techniques you've seen kind of implemented recently that have been a huge help in that area to kind of adjust to everyone's kind of physically in a different place kind of work team?
Not really, probably, but I think it's very important to have your informal chats as well. So it shouldn't be all about work, because one of the pitfalls is because you no longer see each other in real life. Every meeting is going to be on topic, focusing around a certain aspect of work, which takes out of the social part of being in a team, and that ultimately will threaten the cohesiveness of the team, if you will. I think that's very important to also focus on doing that social part as well. So maybe that doesn't have to be daily, but at least weekly. You need to have a session like 30 minutes or an hour in which you're just talking about other stuff besides work, just to keep that team feeling. And probably what we're going to be seeing in the future is your workforce partly working from home and then also on site as well, on-site presence as well. And I think that what we've seen in the last year, if you're looking at, for example, the usage of Zoom and other technologies, it really exploded. And I think it's really improved over the years as well. So the technology is already there, working together remotely is already there. It was just very uncommonly used within a SOC context, probably. And that's getting more and more common. And I think right now, because I've been to my job probably in 2 weeks from now, I'll be working from home for a year. I've been on site like 5 times, maybe 4 or 5 times in that whole year. So it is completely different than before, and you need to have the social aspect, within the team. You need to cherish that and still build on it, even though it's remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. Building those personal relationships within the SOC is a crucial thing. And as we bring in more team members, that maybe weren't members of the team when this whole thing started, it's going to be crucial to make sure you still forge those personal connections to make sure everyone's doing the best job possible and kind of communicating openly and freely. So, yeah.
And one thing which is, I think, very important and might just be like an open door, but I've seen it differently. Turn on your camera if you're doing a meeting. It makes all the difference. There's a lot of non-verbal communication going on for everyone, and you need to take that into account as well. So just turning off your camera and having the audio-only meetings is really killing the atmosphere in the team as well. So always turn on always turn on the camera.
Yep, absolutely agree with that.
Even if it's messy.
We have virtual backgrounds, right?
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our time for today. So thank you very much for joining us. Where can we find all of your awesome content and frameworks and everything we mentioned today? What websites and blogs do you have that we can send listeners to?
So it's the SOC CMM site, which is soc-cmm.com. If you want to look at Tahiti or MaGMa, it's just soccmm.com/MaGMa or /Tahiti. I usually post my new ideas and just questions or insights on my LinkedIn. So you can follow me on my LinkedIn, which is linkedin.com/IN/cyberdefense specialist. and then you can connect with me.
All right. Well, I think that does it for today. Thank you very much, Rob, for joining with us. Thank you so much for your contributions to the community with these awesome, super in detailed frameworks that strike at some of the most confusing and most asked about pieces of running a SOC. So definitely a big thank you for that, and very appreciative of all the effort and thought that went into those things.
Thank you, John, and thanks for having me.
Yep. Have a great one. Hey, Blue Teamers. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Blueprint. If you've got a second and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It would be really meaningful to us. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Your reviews are going to be one of the best ways to help others find this podcast. So anything you could do would be a big help. As always, thank you for listening. You can connect to me on social at SecHub, SECHUBB on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast.